let's review just a little bit about from the previous chapter on the printing press. So, the estimated number of books printed in the first 50 years of printing topped the entire estimated number of the previous 1,000 years. So, as I had mentioned before, the printing press helped lead to public opinion, and that shows you there how impactful the printing press was, and that's kind of leads us to our chapter now on the colonial press. So there weren't presses in the colonies immediately after people had immigrated here. There was a lot of potential for profit for the printer, but getting a printing business going was not easy. You had to construct a fairly complex, fairly expensive piece of equipment, and it also required people who were literate, and there weren't that many literate people in the colonies in the early days. The first newspaper in America was Public Occurrences, published September 25th, 1690 by Benjamin Harris, and he promised to deliver news once a month or more often if any glut of occurrences happens. I like that phrase. We think today with Twitter and our phones and everything else, we get information all the time, instantaneously. But in his day, for Benjamin Harris, he had to have, it was once a month or a glut of occurrences had to happen. So back then, in order to print a newspaper, remember, the colonies were under the rule of England, and you had to have a license in order to print something. Like today, you have to have a driver's license or a license to be a barber or whatever. You don't have to have a license to be a newspaper publisher, but back then you did. And Harris's publication lasted just one issue. He was kind of a troublemaker in England, and he was a troublemaker when he got to the colonies as well. And in his first issue of Public Occurrences, he wrote that the French king had seduced his daughter-in-law. He reported on a suicide, and as you can see here, it also included reflections of a very high nature and sundry doubtful and uncertain reports. So he had fake news from day one. So his newspaper lasted one issue, and that was the end. So the Boston Newsletter, founded in 1704 by John Campbell, was the longest lasting newspaper during the colonial period. It lasted until 1776. And the reason that it lasted so long was Campbell had a license. He also was the postmaster, so he was in charge of distributing the newspaper. So with his license, he could distribute his own newspaper. But he never wrote about anything controversial. That was not the way he was going to do things at all, because he wanted to keep his license. So at one point, give you an example of the kind of how it worked with him and other publications, the governor of Massachusetts, Joseph Dudley, was riding in his carriage down a narrow road outside of Boston, and he encountered a cart laden with wood and driven by a couple young farmers. And Dudley's son waved them to the side of the road and ordered them to let the carriage pass. And the farmers said they were as good a men as the governor, and they refused to move aside. So Dudley, the governor, jumped out of the carriage, drew his sword, and lunged at the farmers, and they took it away from him, broke it in half. And then Dudley screamed insults and tried to whip them, and he had them both arrested for treason. And a sympathetic judge later released them on bond. Not a word of this. This was a big deal in Boston. This caused quite a kerfuffle. But not a word of it was in the Boston Newsletter, because Campbell was not going to report that kind of thing. It was reported in a pamphlet that someone wrote, because there were pamphlets going about at that time, because, as I said, the newspapers required a license, right? So people had to write in some other way. So they had, I guess, the equivalent of, I don't know what you would call it today, maybe a blog or Facebook post or whatever. So, in 1735, John Peter Zenger was put on trial for seditious libel. And this is an important case. Street Matter doesn't mention it in our um, text, but you need to be aware of this. So licensing had ended in 1730, and Zenger was producing a newspaper. And he basically was a printer. He didn't necessarily write what was in the newspaper, but he was responsible because he was the printer. And back then, much of what was published was written anonymously. And so in Zenger's newspaper in New York State, he had advertisements that portrayed the governor as a monkey and his supporters as spaniels. And he was also criticized in stories on the front page. But what really upset Cosby was the way he was portrayed as animals. So he had the newspaper shut down, and Zenger was imprisoned for 9 months for what was called seditious libel. It's important that you understand what seditious libel is. That's basically saying that you are criticizing the government. And truth was not a defense. In fact, if it was proved that what you said was true, that would even work against you even more so. So what happened was his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, not to be confused with Alexander Hamilton, he argued that you should be able to criticize the government, and that was not libel, that you had this right. And this was way before the First Amendment and that kind of thing. So it was different. It was a different kind of argument. It ended up that Zenger still ended up going to prison. But this idea that you could criticize the government and the government officials was really powerful. And this is what Z, writing in the Pennsylvania Gazette, said: if it is not law, it is better than law. It ought to be law and will always be law wherever justice prevails. So John Peter Zenger is one of the important people that we need to keep in mind. You could qualify him as a saint, and most of the saints will be on the test. So when I say someone's a saint, make sure you really understand and know who that person is. So in terms of licensing, also, you could be punished. This is, again, it ended in 1730, but you could be punished not just by having your newspaper shut down, but also you could have your nostrils slit and you could be flogged. So those were impediments to writing without a license, for sure. The Stamp Act came along, and that could not have been a worse idea for the government to impose on the colonists, because it put a tax on all written material. So that included newspapers, and which was really the problem for the government in England. It also put a tax on everything that the lawyers wrote, and so that was one of the problems that really upset people and caused some trouble. So the Connecticut Gazette wrote, "The press is the test of truth, the bulwark of public safety, the guardian of freedom, and the people ought not to sacrifice it." So when that Stamp Act came about, that was one of the things that the Connecticut Gazette wrote. They said, you really need to have the press. And again, this is before the First Amendment, way before that. But people are starting to recognize in the colonies how important the newspaper is. So here's a revolutionary press timeline. So we have Zenger's trial in 1735, promoting the idea at least, that you should be able to criticize the government and government officials. You have the end of the French and Indian War. England felt it had saved the colonies, and so it imposed taxes, and one of those, as just mentioned, was the Stamp Act. The Boston Massacre. So there were English troops that were in the colonies, and you can read about that in Street Matter. He has a lot of that in the chapter. And the Boston Massacre, it wasn't clear exactly what happened, but some troops and some protesters in downtown Boston were fighting, and a gun went off, and someone was shot, and then the fighting got worse, and then it ended up that five Americans, colonists, were killed. And this is how the Boston Gazette published it. And you can see the leading that we talked about in between the columns. So 5 people died. Why are there only 4 caskets in the Boston Gazette? It's because Crispus Attucks was one of those who was killed, and he was an African American and Indian American descent. So he didn't qualify as, I don't know, a human being worthy of a coffin in the newspaper. Anyway, he was arguably the first person to die in the Boston Massacre, and also, you could argue, the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War. So, another thing about the Boston Massacre, if you ever are in Boston and you take a walk on the Freedom Trail, it's fascinating, because you're walking along in downtown Boston and all these high rises, and there's this little metal plate in the middle of the street, and it basically is the spot where the Boston Massacre happened. So in 1774, the Continental Congress, now that's the colonials who are creating their own government, they sanctioned the Tory press. They sanctioned opposition to the Tory press. The Tories were those who were sympathetic to England, and an interesting thing happened. The people in the Continental Congress, the colonists, they said that if someone produced a newspaper or a pamphlet that supported the English government, that they should be punished. And this is how they said they should be punished. If you print or suffer to be printed in your press anything against the rights and liberties of America or in favor of our inveterate foes, the King, Ministry, and Parliament of Great Britain, death and destruction, ruin and perdition shall be your portion. Signed by the order of the Committee of Tarring and Feathering. So from early on, from the very beginning, the American government was fighting against and opposing anybody who wrote anything that they didn't like. So it goes against everything kind of we think about today in terms of the First Amendment. You should be able to print something. You should be able to criticize the government. So we have the Zenger trial where they argue that you can criticize the government, but if you support the British government, well, that's not a good thing. Had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. You can read about that, but that was a battle in which the colonists actually had a victory against the British Army. They fought as like guerrilla fighters, kind of hiding behind trees and walls and stuff. That was something the British weren't really used to. And I like the way the Massachusetts Spy, Isaiah Thomas, wrote about that. Americans forever bear in mind the Battle of Lexington, where the British troops, unmolested and unprovoked, wantonly and in a most cruel manner, fired upon and killed a number of our countrymen, then robbed them of their provisions, ransacked, plundered, and burnt their houses, nor could the tears of defenseless women, some of who were in the pains of childbirth, the cries of helpless babes, nor the prayers of old age confined to beds of sickness, appease their thirst for blood or divert them from the design of murder and robbery. This basically, not basically, it is what we would consider propaganda in this day and age. So you can read about Thomas Paine and Common Sense in Street Matter. That is an important part of what happened during the colonial press. I don't really need to talk too much about that. So I will leave you to read that on your own.